All right. Good morning. All right, we good? Good morning, folks. Welcome to day 2 of our summit. I'm glad to see folks returning here. My name is Sigrid Wright. I am the CEO and Executive Director for the Community Environmental Council, serving the Central Coast of California. And I am pleased to be welcoming you back with my co-chair, Louise Bedsworth. I'm going to kick us off here and just talk a little bit about how we spent yesterday before we dive into today. Yesterday was an ambitious day, and with a lot of great information and great gathering. It really, to me, felt like it gave us a glimpse of what launching a global movement of climate resilience might look like. We heard from leaders around the world, including Kenya and Japan. We heard from Governor Newsom. We heard big numbers. We heard a big call to action with big numbers about from Governor Newsom about how climate action really is a long-term economic strategy, with numbers like investing 1.8 trillion globally in 5 areas of adaptation over the next 10 years could generate 7.1 billion in total net benefits. So big ideas, big numbers, lots of energy. We also heard consistently from Governor Newsom and Secretary Crowfoot about the importance of subnational action. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to really put some meat on the idea of advancing climate resilience at the local and regional level. And we're going to drill down to what does that take? What would that look like, and what would that take? So I'm going to hand it to Louise, who's going to get us teed up for today's sessions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sigrid. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Louise Bedsworth. I am Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We're an interdisciplinary research center at the law school at UC Berkeley, and focused really squarely on how we move policies into action and implementation on the ground. So very excited to be kicking off day 2 of this summit, building on the excellent work and conversation that we had yesterday. I want to take 1 minute and just give a huge shout out to the team at Climate Resolve, who very rapidly pivoted this event to an online virtual setting. And I think it has gone incredibly well. Would encourage everyone, if you haven't, to pop into the lobby. And I was scrolling this morning, great conversation in the chat there. And so while I know we all would have loved and probably could really benefit from being together in this moment as we're working on these things, this has been an incredible opportunity to hear from so many great people, have such broad participation. So just a huge shout out to them for all the work that they have done to get this underway. So for day 2, what we really wanted to do was have an opportunity to dig into the how. How are we going to do this? So we know what we need to do, and we know what many people want to do. So how do we go from the idea of adaptation and resilience into projects on the ground? How do we scale this work in a way that is meaningful and that delivers the benefits and the outcomes that we need to see across all of our communities? So you're going to hear discussion a lot today about this concept of a resilience blueprint. And that was a concept we talked about a lot in planning for this event. And so what is a blueprint? I think there's a lot of different words we could be using, but it really is the sort of nuts and bolts of what do we need to do? What are the projects that we need to get on the ground? Hard infrastructure projects, what I think of as soft infrastructure projects, things that are gray infrastructure, that are green infrastructure. So what are all of the projects that we need? And then how do we line up the funding and the financing and the process to see those projects into reality on the ground? And so in this session, we're going to talk about sort of blueprints, but really try to dig into what does it look like to actually do this work. So we're going to kick it off. We have 2 great participants, and Sigrid and I will pop in and out as well. But we are joined by Nguyen Tara Key, who's the Executive Director of Programs at California Forward. Also spent a long time working for the state of California, leading a lot of adaptation and resilience work there. So can really introduce us to this overall concept of the continuum of adaptation and resilience work. This is a process. It is iterative. It is nonlinear. So she's going to introduce that conceptually. Then we'll turn to Carly Browne, who's the Deputy Executive Director at the Institute for Local Government, with an incredible set of experience working with different communities around the state. They have led the Beacon program and the Boost program, and so really know how different communities are approaching and tackling these issues. So we're going to kick it off with Nguyen Tara introducing this idea of a adaptation resilience continuum. We'll then turn to Carly to hear about where some different communities are falling on that continuum. Sigrid and I will both share some examples that we think provide nice, sort of very brief examples of points on that continuum. Then we'll have some time for questions and hopefully a little wrap up before we pop in to the rest of the day. So thank you all again so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to Nguyen Tara.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Louise. And I have some slides here that I think are going to come up, but while we wait for those, just a quick introduction. As was mentioned, I'm Nguyen Tara Key, Executive Director of Programs at California Forward, and we're a statewide nonprofit working to build a movement for a new California economy, one that is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And at the core of that is bringing climate into everything we do related to our economy and economic development. So it's wonderful to be here today. And as Louise mentioned, I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're calling adaptation kind of continuum, and looking to really help frame out kind of how do we understand the climate adaptation process. As Louise mentioned, this is not a linear kind of static process here, but is a circular, and oftentimes even this representation here is probably an oversimplification because it doesn't always go in a single direction around this circle. But for the sake of kind of framing out the process here, we'll just quickly walk through what that process generally looks like. And what's here today is built on, significant and years of work really mapping out what does adaptation look like from across the community of practice. And so this is a very standard kind of framework or approach to adaptation. Next slide, please. So the start is really around building awareness and problem recognition. And, as we go through each step in the adaptation continuum, there are some kind of consistent, what we're calling here, characteristics of readiness in terms of what that stage in the process looks like. So here it is kind of a recognition that there is an issue, but probably limited kind of understanding of what it really means locally. There's some initial stakeholder interest, but not a kind of formal commitment, and no formal data collection or climate assessments have been done. So it's recognizing there's a problem, not quite, organized to start taking action, but some initial steps underway to start this process. Next slide, please. The next stage is getting into that deeper understanding of really what are the vulnerabilities and assessing those and starting the planning process to better understand what those vulnerabilities mean in a given context or geography. And so this, in terms of characteristics of readiness, this is where you start to see increased stakeholder interest growing and initial buy-in, early stage climate risk assessments, as I mentioned, and identification of specific sectors or areas, geographies within a community that are specifically or uniquely vulnerable. And next step, please. Next slide, please. And from that initial kind of vulnerability and planning stage, then that leads into the strategy development, and prioritization phase. And this is where you tend to see increased institutional commitments, really charting out what are the specific actions and priorities that are needed to respond to the vulnerabilities that were identified in the previous step, that vulnerability assessment and planning, and really setting out defined adaptation goals and prioritization of action. Just a quick note here. I think one area of evolution I think that I've seen personally in the kind of field of adaptation practice and resilience practice is in this stage of the process, the importance of really setting a clear set of outcomes and outcome-based priorities that are guiding the work of adaptation and resilience. Because as we all know, adaptation is complex. It touches every sector of our community, every sector of our economy, and really being able to articulate the outcomes that we are all working towards and that these strategies and priorities are driving towards is a critical piece, and I think an important evolution that I've seen over the years in terms of this stage of the work. It also is really important if we go to the next slide, because those outcome-based priorities help us understand how to track our progress over time, which is another important kind of evolution of the field of practice and adaptation resilience is our increasing sophistication there. But at this stage in the process, you're really seeing adaptation being embedded into government budgets and governance structures, identification and development of stable funding mechanisms. I know there were a number of sessions yesterday that touched on this and the importance of this, and then really integrating and operationalizing climate across policies and building that technical capacity to sustain it. And the next slide. And then that last, yep, okay. Anyway, so then there's another slide here, but something happened that is really around that monitoring and evaluation, right? This is a continuum. It is a cyclical process. It's not linear. You're learning through the investment in adaptation, kind of adaptive management, monitoring and evaluation, and then learning from that and kicking the whole process off again, or hopping over to some of those other dots in this continuum and reinvesting in continued vulnerability assessments or reevaluating strategies, for example. So that is the continuum, a very neat and tidy way of presenting a very complex process here. But I think from here, we really want to get a sense from everyone who's on the line of where you are in that continuum. So I'm going to hand it back to Louise.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're going to try to make use of a poll to ask for folks who are here and who joined us if you have a sense of where you sit on that continuum, or if you don't know, or if it's not relevant, you can also indicate that. So that poll will pop up here. So hopefully folks can answer that question, and then and that'll help us as we sort of think through the rest of the day. But maybe with that, Carly, I'll turn to you to maybe share the experience from the work you all have been doing at ILG, sort of where you're seeing communities fall on that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So for those of you who don't know, the Institute for Local Government is a nonprofit affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work with all local governments across the state to help them navigate complex problems on a variety of different topics, but specifically as well, climate resilience. And so one of the ways we do that is through our BOOST program. And that's a partnership between the Strategic Growth Council and ILG to really provide technical assistance and capacity building support for some of the most vulnerable communities in our state. Now, these communities are pretty much in the first stage of the continuum, and they are very aware of the issues they face, but haven't really been able to advance in their journey because they just have small staffs that wear many, many, many hats. They have little to no funding, for anything but the basics, certainly no funding to address really climate specific issues. And these are cities like the city of Calipatria, which is on the, in Lithium Valley, Imperial Valley, which is near the border of Mexico. And that city has an annual operating budget of just $4.2 million. So, I mean, if you think about that, they're a full service city. So that's police, fire, wastewater, and whatnot. And they have $4.2 million to do everything. That's staff, projects, everything, streets, roads, whatnot. There's not a lot of room. There's great people, dedicated people working there, and they try to overlap their projects, but they just don't have those extra dollars. And in round 2 of Boost, we worked with the city of Barstow, and we were able to secure this great grant. It was a Cal OES Jumpstart grant for nearly $700,000, almost $800,000. And that was to hire a chief resilience officer to develop a resilience plan for the city. But quite frankly, we struggled to find an experienced candidate to apply for the job because these are small rural communities with temperatures average, it's sometimes in the summer about 120. So it's not a really desirable place to work, and they have a really hard time finding folks. And then we have a beacon program that we work with, and that we have 170 cities, counties, and special districts in that program. And they're on all different areas in the spectrum. So there's cities like Redwood City, which is in the Bay Area. They had an extensive 2-year public engagement process to update their climate action plan. They developed a sea level rise vulnerability assessment study and an adaptation plan, and these plans really guide the city. It guides their continuous monitoring, their adaptive management for sea level rise and other climate impacts. It also outlines strategies to address things like flood hazards along the shoreline. And now they're actually moving into developing coastal resilience strategies. They're going to identify and design different solutions for mitigating that sea level rise and improve their levee system. So they're doing some great things there. And then I will say, in these talks, I always like to try to, talk about the unusual suspects, the cities that we don't think are doing a lot, but they actually are. But I'm sorry for this one, I'm going to just have to uplift the city of San Diego, because they've been doing a lot. They've been working proactively, implementing climate adaptation projects, and with a real strong focus on equity and engagement. So ILG worked with the city of San Diego back in 2021 to develop its first climate adaptation plan. The city made it clear from the very beginning that the focus of the partnership was to ensure that equity was at the heart of that plan. And they actually invested an extra $50,000 to fund ILG, so we can support 5 community-based organizations to conduct this really authentic and inclusive community engagement in what the city calls their communities of concern, which is disadvantaged or vulnerable cities or communities. So we engaged the CBOs. We held meetings to share information, best practices, and different ways we can support those CBOs. We had some hard conversations. There were some conversations around trust. We helped rebuild the trust and identify some kind of past promises that may not have been kept, and, really heard from these CBOs about, their lived experience with climate resilience and, how they felt they've kind of been left behind. So the CBOs led a variety of engaging activities, from tabling with community events. They really went to the community where they were to try to create this kind of accessible engagement. We had online platforms where they can submit feedback in real time. And it really led to the creation of what they call the Climate Resilient SD Plan. And that is really a comprehensive blueprint for kind of addressing the challenges like extreme heat and drought and wildfires, extreme rainfall and sea level rise. And so many of these local governments, they get stuck in the planning phase and they plan. But the city of San Diego is well into implementation of its resilience strategies. They've already developed the climate change design guidelines for their stormwater infrastructure. It's regularly updated and based on new state guidance and scientific research. They've developed their coastal resilience master plan. That was funded with over $1 million from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the State Coastal Conservancy. And the city has really begun implementing its pure water program. So that's a multi-year initiative to supply nearly half of San Diego's water locally by 2035. So it's supported in part by a $164 million EPA water infrastructure finance and innovation loan. So that's a loan. And these are just kind of a few of the many strategies that the city has begun to implement. I think there's several factors that have really contributed to the city's ability to implement in such innovative programs and really create resilience for some of their most vulnerable communities. And those are the opposite from what the cities I mentioned before. So they have equity as their core value. The city's leadership has embedded equity into its culture. I would say next that the city has dedicated staff for climate mitigation and resilience. So they have two different teams that work very closely together. Their success is driven by this very skilled and dedicated team. They don't only write out the plans, but they really have an active role in securing funding and seeking funding for implementation and seeing those projects through to fruition. And I would say next, they, have these long-term authentic community partnerships. They were not easy. I will say the community has been known to sue, the CBOs have been known to sue the city and really hold them accountable. But they have this really important authentic dialogue that keeps both working towards the same goal. And I think that's really important. Just a few more things. I think the city invests its own money in resilience and equity. They actually created an equity fund where they have a steering committee that kind of prioritizes projects and designs where that money goes. And then lastly, they just have systems of accountability. And so I think they built this kind of robust system that ensures public accountability. And I think those things really create this foundation for them to not only plan, but find funding and really implement these climate resilience strategies.
Great. Thank you so much. Next, I'll turn to Sigrid to share the work you all have been doing in Santa Barbara and the Central Coast. Oh, yeah, sorry. And we wanted to share the results from the poll so everyone can see where folks are falling on the continuum. There we go. And so it looks like we've actually got a nice little curve there. So that's terrific to see so many people in the strategy development and prioritization phase. So terrific. Thank you guys so much. So Sigrid, when I turn to you.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a story from the Central Coast of California. But first, I want to give a little quick background. I would consider Santa Barbara and the Central Coast to have a really long history and self-identity around environmentalism. It was the site of the largest oil spill in the country at that time in 1969. It was one of the catalysts for the ecology movement and the first International Earth Day. But even despite that, the Central Coast really, while we became aware of climate change early on, we were mostly focused on carbon reduction. And I felt like I tried for years to get the conversation going about preparation or adaptation and just could not get it moving until, not surprisingly, in other communities have probably seen this as well, until we had a tragedy. And in 2018, that was the Thomas Fire, which was at that time the largest fire in the state history. And it was followed by a tragic debris flow, which took 23 lives. So that was a really defining tragedy for this community. And like the type of thing where you remember if you were here or not here, if you were here at that time, you remember where you were and how it impacted you. So up until that point on the continuum, I would say we hadn't really even started. And that was as recently as 7 years ago. We then saw a burst of activity in community awareness and vulnerability assessments and planning. And within a really few short years, we saw the launch of academic leadership out at UCSB, the Climate Hazard Center, the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center, the UC Disaster Resilience Network, which is chaired at UCSB. We saw our city of Santa Barbara launch a sustainability and resilience department, so actually baking it into the name. And we saw the County of Santa Barbara do a climate vulnerability assessment. So that's just kind of the background to the story I'm going to tell here. Our role, the Community Environmental Council's role, really is in engaging the community. So making sure that the people who are affected by the problem are part of designing the solution. And the example I want to talk about is a community-led climate resilience action plan for Santa Barbara County. I'm actually going to pop in the chat here the link to that plan. And I'm going to walk you through how that project unfolded. So there were kind of 3 steps that we led here. The first was we listened. From 2018 to 2020, we held a series of roundtables framed topically around the climate threats that had been identified for our region by the state. So all ones that you would anticipate: extreme heat, drought, wildfire, extreme storms, and sea level rise. So quite a lot for one region. The second thing after we listened, and those were really, those roundtables were held in a way to kind of in a unique way to really hear personal stories. And they were attended by everyone from the CEO of the county all the way through laborers. In the report, what emerged was that folks were most worried about wildfire resilience and heat and smoke protection, and that the community, so we got very clear guidance from the community. This is what they wanted to focus on. And the community also provided some really specific ideas that could address these threats, which we then compiled into a matrix and prioritized. And then the third thing we did is we started to take action from that. So we tried to move us quickly on that continuum into the action stage. One of the suggestions that emerged from the roundtables was to compile a list of fundable, shovel-ready wildfire resilience projects. And so we put together a collaborative. That collaborative has now identified more than 70 projects, many in really specific and in neighborhoods. So things like removing highly flammable plants like matchstick palms from a particular creek, or deploying goats for vegetation removal in a homeowners association that's in a high fire risk area, or creating green agricultural buffer zones. So that team is focused first on areas with high fire risk plus high social vulnerability. So we had some other data that we received that's very neighborhood level that we received from another nonprofit, Direct Relief. And then we started to move into kind of pre-development and getting those projects shovel ready for implementation. And so that's where we're at right now. I wanted to just speak briefly about like how all that came together, because particularly at this moment in time when we're we're dealing with a state that's got budget constraints, and we're not seeing much. We're going to see drying up of funding from federal sources. This was really a great space for kind of private funding and catalyst funding. So the initial roundtables and the initial compilation of that report I just shared was funded by our community foundation. And then that wildfire collaborative that I just mentioned, with the identification of shovel-ready projects, that has been funded by a private, is really attractive to private funders, particularly those who are accustomed to being front-end catalyst funding. We're dealing with projects that are in kind of like tranches. So that's the story that I wanted to share from Santa Barbara.
Great. Thank you all so much. And so what I'm going to do, we have 3 minutes left. And so much that just came up across all three of you. So I want to sort of use this as an opportunity to tee up and get everyone excited about the rest of the day, when we're going to be covering a lot of these elements in a lot more detail. So if we think about how we build a blueprint, how do we operationalize equity? How do we integrate information, local knowledge, scientific information? How do we think about extreme events, risk, and insurance? How do we address some of these cross-cutting issues around public health, climate migration, these really that are, really important to integrate into these resilience planning and projects, We're also going to have breakouts where we want everyone to hear from all of you. So we have 2 more questions that we're going to ask you that we would love for you to answer, while I also then close out this session by asking each of our panelists to highlight what you think as one of the critical ingredients, if you will, for moving along the continuum. And you could think about that in terms of, where do you think it maybe is the hardest? Is it getting started? Is it moving from one step to the other? And then what are the things, what is the thing that you see as being critically important to make that movement happen? So maybe I'll start with you, Nuantara, then go to Carly, and then Sigrid.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is a challenge, but also critically important, is to recognize that climate adaptation and resilience, while it takes dedicated resources, understanding, vulnerability assessments, it isn't a standalone. It has to be part of everything that we do, and it needs to be operationalized in existing policies, in existing investment. And that is, I think, a big challenge in terms of how you actually structurally do that, say, across local government or in a community, and really embed it in existing decision-making. But I think that is really the pathway to scaling implementation at the right scale. So I would leave it with that.
Great.
Yeah, I just
Carly?
piggyback off that and say, you know, the governor's office had a great grant program called the Regional Climate Collaboratives, and it was, very, very popular. Folks set up kind of collaboratives or, you know, proposed collaboratives in their community, and even the process of applying for these grants, of getting folks from education, local government, regional government, community-based organizations to really get together and talk about what projects would look like and try to prioritize those projects. And yes, it was to go after grant funding. There was a lot of movement that was made there. And unfortunately, now they need the funding. And, you know, I hate that being the answer to so many of these questions, but so many of the projects that they have planned and that they want to do take both, like you said, soft and hard infrastructure. And so to get the funding to do both is really, really difficult. So we need to teach them how to layer different fundings, how to do, you know, policy as well as planning, as well as implementation at the same time, and really meet several different objectives with one project.
And Sigrid, why don't you close us out?
I'll just say ditto, ditto, ditto across the board. And really important to have the community involved. This just can't come top down. It has to come from both directions. And that, so that's my final message.
Great. Well, thank you all. And I hope everyone will stick around for the rest of the day, because we look forward to engaging with all of you on these topics. And thank you for the polling Climate Resolve team.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys for kicking us off. That was excellent. This session is now closed, so if everyone would join the next one from our lobby. Thank you.